Hello, my friends. You might have heard the opinion spread by some of the interesting experts saying that Russia managed to build a new type of economy to maintain its military capabilities and continue the war in Ukraine. And partially, in a short-term perspective, yes, this statement was correct. But whether Russia is capable to win this war of attrition, which might last for years and years, I honestly have doubts about it. And there are some of the signs showing that the Russian economy is already in the process of stagflation. Yeah, it may take some of the years for Russian economy to collapse, but the signs are vivid, they're evident. Russia will decline. Yeah, I understand that there are also voices from another side telling you already for a few years that Russian economy is collapsing, and still Russia is out there, still they produce military components, they hire military personnel for the war in Ukraine. So I understand that many people may not believe, mistrust this idea, or be even a little bit sad that it hasn't yet happened to Russia. But no worries, it will happen. Russia just this huge country with lots of the resources, and it requires some of the times for it to stagflate or stagnate completely. Especially nowadays that there are the countries which are still willing to make business with Russia as usual, and some of the countries like China, they even support the Russian war machine. This war wouldn't be possible for such extensive period of time, for almost 4 years already, without the huge support of China. But despite even that support, Kremlin is struggling finding out resources to fuel its war machine. So to discuss all of that, we need to understand what is stagflation. First of all, it's the high inflation. The rate in Russia is more than 10%. Officially it's 8%, but unofficially it could be up to 16% according to different statistics of Russia. Let's say more or less independent statistics. Stagflation is also the absence of the economic growth, and for the first time this year it was the lowest economic growth possible for Russia, 0.6%, but the next year will be the first official one for the Russian economy to go into decline. And the Russian budget is based on the growth of the Russian economy. Since the start of the war, Russia spent more than $500 billion to maintain its military, which now takes 40% of entire Russian spendings. So without the real economic growth, Russia will not be able to maintain its military at the current production rates. And we see that even now there are some of the crises happening in some of the facilities of Russia. Yes, military production facilities, like for example Uralvagonzavod that produces Russian tanks like T-90, T-72, Russian BMPs, BMP-3, and some of the other systems. Well, in 2023 and 2024, Russia hired more than 30% of the personnel working in those military factories, and 2025 is the first one, then this figure goes to decline. Especially, again, Uralvagonzavod, where there are massive layoffs. Now it's roughly 7% from entire industry of this facility, and 50% of the people will be laid off in some specific departments. So as for stagflation, I already mentioned the high inflation, the economy decline, so the absence of economic growth, which is forecasted already for 2026. And the third thing is the most important one, the lowering of the purchasing capabilities of people, of Russians. Now we see the huge decline in the Russian purchasing capabilities. This parameter goes low. First of all, it is connected to inflation. Secondary, it's because of the expensive credits. The key rate is now artificially lowered to, I think now it's 16%, but before central bank put it to 21%. Putin didn't like it, so he ordered central bank to lower it just for everything to look okay, but the money are still expensive. Not only Russians have problems with obtaining some of the Western-made goods, but even their own made are getting too expensive. We may take any sort of the production, let's say sophisticated one, Lada vehicles. The prices of those, they're skyrocketed by multiple of the times. No alternate, lack of the components, the general inflation, hard to get the money to invest in production, and here you go. Each car costs 1 million, 2 million rubles for very basic model. And it is not just for the cars, it's in every sphere of the Russian economy where stagflation plays the great role. Even traditionally strong spheres of the Russian economy, like for example metal production or agriculture sector, they start to decline. They drop down by around 7%, and with food production it is getting even worse. It drops by 0.5, 0.8% as far as I remembered in statistics each month. Yeah, Russia still produces the good figures of GDP, but Russians themselves, they don't feel it, and they start to accumulate money in bank accounts and also just in their homes. They do not invest their own money in the Russian economy because they expect it to decline even more. And those GDP figures may look very nice, but it just shows the consumption of the Russian resources in producing something that is getting destroyed on the front lines. I mean, all of the military components, tanks, rifles, artillery systems, drones, everything of that is just gone in Ukraine. There is no additional value. You cannot do anything with what you spend the money for. It is wasting money for military purposes. They will never ever pay back. Well, in the short term, it is actually possible, as we saw for the last 2-3 years. More of the workplaces were created in the Russian military, but now it also started to decline. Also now there are huge issues with the contracts that the Russian government signed with factories that produce the military components. First of all, Russia takes the money in loan to pay for that production. But even now, Russia doesn't want to pay out that loan. And those banks that lent the money to the Russian government, they're in a deep problem. And the only variant for the Russian government to compensate this huge debt hole is to sell oil for more or less okay prices. But we see that even there, it's not okay for Russia because the oil prices, they go down. We entered this age of the low oil prices, and Russia, as the main exporter of the oil, and oil is the blood of the Russian economy, it also suffers. Yes, Donald Trump administration also applied some of the sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft companies. Those are the biggest ones in Russia. But we see how some of the other players, like for example in India, they now think that maybe it's better to trade with Russia. After all, they accept the possible risks of the secondary sanctions applied, so now they change to the bigger companies back into the game. We'll see how it goes later on, but I do not expect any sort of the harsh reaction from the Donald Trump's administration. I think that the aim of those sanctions was to restructure the market and make the American companies, including ExxonMobil, to cooperate with Russian Lukoil or Rosneft companies more. Especially then we know that some of the people affiliated with Donald Trump's family are in the management of Lukoil company. So everything of that is interconnected. What Donald Trump looks in this so-called peace deal is just the solution for him personally to make the business with Russia. Him, his family, maybe America after all, but I have doubts about it. And honestly, there is no any cooperation, business cooperation, a real one possible between USA and Russia because they are competitors in resource selling market. And the only obstacle for Donald Trump to achieve this deal is the war in Ukraine. That's why he is now pushing Ukraine for some sort of the capitulation deal. He wants to make it as soon as possible because he is eager to make the business as usual with Russia. Now, Russia, under the sanctions from the United States of America, European sanctions, it definitely struggles. And about the functioning of the Russian economy, you see, such a big and complicated country as Russia requires robust logistics routes, and now they're under the question because Russian aviation industry is also in a deep problem. Russia doesn't have this reliable supplier for the spare parts for the aircraft to maintain those, not just commercial aviation, but also cargo airplanes. And by the way, commercial aviation is mostly used for cargo transportation. Yes, then you fly in commercial airliner, not just your baggage is out there in a cargo hold, But lots of the other cargo people pay to deliver parcels and everything of that, you usually get those by usual airplanes. So to maintain this internal market, internal economy working for Russia especially, they need spare parts for their airplanes. They don't have their own produced airplanes like it was in the Soviet Union. They didn't have this sort of the problem, but Russia now has, because everything what they use is mainly not made in Russia. And you cannot just replace it from China like that. No, it takes a while, it takes some time. And even China uses mostly Western-made jets. You simply have the success to get Airbuses or Boeings, and it's easier to maintain those elsewhere, because the infrastructure is working on those airplanes especially. You may have the spare parts in every part of the world, excluding some of the countries like Iran or Russia, but the rest, you have technicians, you have everything working accordingly. So for Russia, it's the huge problem, but again, Donald Trump, it seems like he wants to save them, making some of the shadow schemes working more or less okay, like for example via Belarus. The White House lifted some of the sanctions from Belarus. Now they are capable to receive the spare parts, but we know that Belarus is like one more oblast for the Russian Federation, so of course all of those spare parts, they will end up in Russia itself. And in general in Russia, all of the machine building is now dependent on their support by their friends. First of all, China. But even China cannot replace everything. Yeah, China supplies lots of the components, and sometimes they're marked as produced by a Russian industry complex, but it's not like that. China really gains from the situation happening in Russia. They gain a huge profit from Russia because, first of all, they consume quite cheap resources. Russia is unable to sell its gas and oil widely to Europe as it did before. Still they sell, but not as much as before the full-scale war. So China, India, those countries, they're the main consumers of the cheap fossil fuels, and they may tell to Russia, if you want to sell this oil for us, please reduce the price, otherwise we're going to purchase it from some other countries, like for example Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. So it makes Russia more dependent. It lost the part of its sovereignty. It follows the policy of China. And the dreams about disconnection of this very tight relation between Russia and China, they will not become true, unfortunately, in the coming years. Because of the war, actually China managed to slave Russia in many of the spheres, especially in oil and in general in the Russian economy. I understand that it's Trump's dream probably to make Russia an ally and put it against China, but Russia and China, they understand this trick and they will never ever agree on this. Well, as far as there is Putin's regime in Russia, we'll see the same picture. And you know, today there was this statement from Lavrov, who is the foreign minister of Russian Federation. He stated that in case of the escalation in Taiwan, Russia obviously will support China. It seems like they have some of the forecast for us for 2026, and obviously Russia will try to support China in the way it can. Russia struggles in Ukraine, but still they have some of their reserve resources. I do not expect that Russia may deploy its army to help China with Taiwan, but as Secretary of NATO Mark Rutte stated that Russia and China may start simultaneous escalation against Western democracies. For example, Russia may start its special military operation in Baltics, a limited one, not like the full-scale war in Ukraine, but something like Suwalki corridor operation to get to Kaliningrad, for example. And China may start its special landing operation, which could be the biggest military operation in a human history if they really want to do it. And there are some of the signs that China really wants that to happen, but that's the topic of another video. So back to the Russian economy, definitely there are huge issues with Russian energy sector, gas and oil, and we see that Ukraine also applies kinetic sanctions to target not just the Russian oil facilities, but also refineries, plus the oil ports in Novorossiysk, Russian tankers, everything of that, step by step, is ruining the Russian fossil fuel economy, first of all. Russia has to put huge discounts on its oil because it's even physically risky now to operate with Russian companies. It's risky also to operate in the Black Sea entirely. The Russian Gazprom company that before was a pearl of the Russian economy in general, now it's declining for several years in a row. Russia tried some of the economy dances with restructurization of the debt of the company, but it doesn't help. The debt is growing exponentially, as well as for other companies too. Well, there's still some of the companies that bring profits, but not as many as before. And if the flagship is sinking down, it's not the sign of the healthy Russia at all. So Russia itself, based on their actions elsewhere, they don't have this planning forecast for the future. They're living months by months. One day the shadow scheme played well, okay, we have some of the income, but what to do next? No one knows. Russia is just this blind pilot flying its jet somewhere. Now it goes right into the mountain. All of the systems are warning them about the imminent impact, but they are not just blind, they're even deaf. Probably the only sensation Russian management has is the tactile sensation, but they will feel it only upon impact. And as we know, it's gonna be too late. But still, Russia is a big resource economy. It's a big country, big population, so it requires extensive period of time for Russia to finally collapse. Its economy, its regime, it's basically the playbook of the Soviet Union collapse. Then there was the drop of the oil prices for a very extensive period of time. There was the military conflict that was exhausting the Soviet Union resources, Afghanistan war. There was the weapon production race in the Cold War. There were multiple of the countries which were dependent on Soviet Union support, and Soviet Union just spent too much and its economy just declined. People lived their miserable lives. By the time Soviet Union was still producing some of the military equipment using its military industrial complex. So it's always number one priority for any sort of the system led by Kremlin. Whether it's Soviet Union, Russian Empire, they have priority for military. And Putin, as he was born in the Soviet Union in the 50s, he understands how Russians potentially may struggle. What was the deficit for them in 80s, the post-Soviet era, how miserably Russians potentially could live. To be honest, now they're still far away from that state, but they are heading towards it. And soon it's gonna be the internal instability of Russia itself. That's one more reason why Putin is not willing to stop this war in Ukraine, because he afraid for Russia to follow the same destiny of the Soviet Union. But it's imminent. It will be like that. And Putin, with his actions, he just accelerates all of those events that bring the end of Russia closer. And the final nail in the coffin of the Russian economy will be this special military operation, because Russia not just waits its military resources and economy to continue this war, but also they lose their people. Demographics in Russia was crazy bad even before the start of the special military operation, but now it's absolutely disastrous. Lots of the people were mobilized, basically. They used to work in different areas, different companies. So Russia has to replace those, but sometimes they don't have the qualified personnel, and they are calling for immigrants even to go to Russia. For now, it's the silent call, but I saw multiple of the videos of even people from Bangladesh and India queuing in front of the immigration centers to obtain permission for work in Russia, and they've been granted because Russian economy, for Russia, it's the only variant to sustain itself, to get this workforce from abroad. But again, those foreigners, they're coming just to earn money. They will not be the part of the Russian culture or the Russian world, Russian peace. That's why the Russian Z-bloggers, Russian patriots, they're screaming about it. What is happening? We're being flatlined on the front lines with those midwave attacks, and now those people are coming to replace us. Everything is not going according to the plan, it seems like. That's, by the way, the thing. Then some of the speakers, as Tucker Carlson, they're saying, oh, Russia has a white population, the biggest white population relative to not the white one. Here he is completely wrong. And also he says that Russia is the Christian country. But Russia has more Muslim people than, for example, Muslims are living in the United States of America. Here I am mentioning the percentage relation of the general population, not the exact numbers of the people in particular. So in Russia, it's more than 7%, as far as I remember, Muslim people. In the United States, close to 2, from what I also might remember, but you may check out yourself in Google search. Well, what Tucker says usually is just a pure hypocrisy. He's just this Russian asset and not the most valuable one. So yeah, with this war, Russia is in a deep problem for decades ahead. Just because of the political ambitions, they ruined everything. Its population, perspectives for economy. There is no any opportunity for foreign investors to invest in any sort of the sector of Russian economy, to obtain the profitable credit, to open the company. No, this doesn't work any longer in Russia, and finally it will cause Russia to collapse. First of all, economy, and economy is about everything. Without economy, no any other sphere is sustainable. Economy was the reason, one of those, but the main one, for the Soviet Union to collapse. There was also the ideological thing, that people didn't believe in those social or close to communism values. Well, in Russia, we see also that even patriot community, they do not understand what is happening. I mean, Z patriots. For them, it's like a nightmare. Then they have those crazy losses, especially then Ukraine is gaining the ground, like for example, it was recently in Kupiansk. They were screaming, what is happening? What is happening? Well, I can tell what is happening actually. It's the gradual collapse of the Russian Empire. That's it. We're gonna see it. We already witnessed it. By the way, it started not from the war in Ukraine. It started a long time ago. I would say a century ago, even more, from the collapse of the Russian original empire. Later on, Soviet Union was created with this crazy ideology. Then it collapsed, and now there's gonna be hopefully a final collapse of Russia within, let's say, 10 years. We'll see if I am correct about this perspective, but I hope that in 10 years we're not going to see Putin, we're not going to see even Russia as it is right now. I think that the only variant for people to survive on territory of Russia is to split into multiple, the bunch of independent countries. That's the only way. Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Buryatia, Ichkeria, which is now Chechnya, many others. Everything will be split. That is my forecast. I'm sure that it's the best case scenario for those people who live there, in locals. And they may have their own cultural identity and be the real part of this world, not just serving to Moscow, to Putin's regime, as it was for centuries under the ruling of the Russian Tsar or communists. Well guys, I guess it's all for today. That's the video about Russian economy, and I'm sure that we're gonna see very interesting things developing pretty much soon. Stay positive, see you around, ciao.